is probably the most amazing thing you do, and it defines you as being human.
And you do it with ease, so much so you barely notice you're doing it.
E a volte quando lo fai puoi trasportare gli altri
ਤਾਂ ਇਹ ਦੂਸਰਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਕਿਸੇ ਹੋਰ ਹੀ ਦੁਨੀਆ ਵਿੱਚ ਲੈ ਜਾਂਦੀ ਹੈ। ਅਤੇ ਕਦੇ-ਕਦੇ ਜਦੋਂ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਇਸ ਨੂੰ ਕਰਦੇ ਹੋ,
你成天想忘却的思考和决策。
di che cosa sto parlando?
your ability to talk.
Or more precisely, the way you use language.
Il linguaggio.
Pasha.
Ulwimi.
Language.
From the moment we're born, we have language in our lives.
Hi, baby.
A unique ability that defines us as human.
I can walk up to someone I don't know, and I can make a sequence of noises that I've never made before by pushing air through my mouth. I will take a thought in my head and make it go into their head. And that's an incredible trick.
Other animals may use sounds to communicate, but we're the only ones on the planet who can talk.
Speech and language distinguishes us from all other species. We are not only using words to be able to express ourselves, but we're really expressing our thought processes that are unique to ourselves.
For most of us, it just happens.
Is such a sophisticated skill, and yet children learn it so easily with minimal effort at all.
That's Mummy.
And when you start thinking about it, it is quite miraculous how the brain does it.
But despite decades of research, how we learn to talk remains a mystery. How did this ability evolve? Why is it uniquely human? And is it something we are born with, or something that we learn?
It strikes me as surprising and odd that we know an enormous amount about, for example, the first fractions of a second in the history of the universe. But we really know very little at all about what makes us human and where language comes from.
My son, soon after his first birthday, would say gaga to mean water. And over the course of the next half year, he slowly learned to approximate the proper adult form, water. So we're going to cruise through half a year in about 40 seconds. No video here, so you can focus on the sound, the acoustics of a new kind of trajectory. Gaga to water. He sure nailed it, didn't he? So he didn't just learn water. Over the course of the 24 months, the first 2 years that we really focused on, this is a map of every word he learned in chronological order. And because we have full transcripts, we've identified each of the 503 words that he learned to produce by his second birthday. He was an early talker. And so we started to analyze why. Why were certain words born before others? This is one of the first results that came out of our study a little over a year ago that really surprised us. The way to interpret this apparently simple graph is on the vertical is an indication of how complex caregiver utterances are based on the length of utterances. And the vertical axis is time. And all of the data we aligned based on the following idea. Every time my son would learn a word, we would trace back and look at all of the language he heard that contained that word. And we would plot the relative length of the utterances. And what we found was this curious phenomena that caregiver speech would systematically dip to a minimum, making language as simple as possible, and then slowly ascend back up in complexity. And the amazing thing was that that bounce, that dip, lined up almost precisely with when each word was born. Word after word, systematically. So it appears that all three primary caregivers, myself, my wife, and our nanny, were systematically, and I would think subconsciously, restructuring our language to meet him at the moment of the birth of a word and bring him gently into more complex language. And the implications of this, there are many, but one I just want to point out is that there must be amazing feedback loops. It's not, of course, my son is learning from his linguistic environment, but the environment is learning from him. That environment, people, are in these tight feedback loops and creating a kind of scaffolding that has not been noticed until now. But that's looking at the speech context. What about the visual context? We're now looking at, think of this as a dollhouse cutaway of our house. We've taken those circular fisheye lens cameras and we've done some optical correction, and then we can bring it into three-dimensional life. So welcome to my home. This is a moment, one moment captured across multiple cameras. The reason we did this is to create the ultimate memory machine, where you can go back and interactively fly around and then breathe video life into this system. What I'm going to do is give you an accelerated view of 30 minutes, again, of just life in the living room. That's me and my son on the floor, and there's video analytics that are tracking our movements. My son is leaving red ink, I'm leaving green ink. We're now on the couch looking out through the window at cars passing by, and finally my son playing in a walking toy by himself. Now we freeze the action, 30 minutes. We turn time into the vertical axis, and we open up for a view of these interaction traces we've just left behind. And we see these amazing structures. These little knots of two colors of thread we call social hotspots. The spiral thread we call a solo hotspot. And we think that these affect the way language is learned. What we'd like to do is start understanding the interaction between these patterns and the language that my son is exposed to see if we can predict how the structure of when words are heard affects when they're learned. So in other words, the relationship between words and what they're about in the world. So here's how we're approaching this. In this video, again, my son is being traced out. He's leaving red ink behind, and there's our nanny by the door.
You want water? All right.
She offers water, and off go the two worms over to the kitchen to get water. And what we've done is use the word water to tag that moment, that bit of activity. And now we take the power of data and take every time my son ever heard the word water and the context he saw it in, and we use it to penetrate through the video and find every activity trace that co-occurred with the instance of water. And what this data leaves in its wake is a landscape. We call these wordscapes. This is the wordscape for the word water. And you can see most of the action is in the kitchen. That's where those big peaks are over to the left. And just for contrast, we can do this with any word. We can take the word bye, as in goodbye, and we're now zoomed in over the entrance to the house, and we look and we find, as you'd expect, a contrast in the landscape where the word bye occurs much more in a structured way. So we're using these structures to start predicting the order of language acquisition.
Learning to talk.
Her elderly parents have been charged with child abuse.
This is the scene of the crime. A child was locked in a room and tied to a potty chair for most of her life. Completely restrained, she was forced to sit alone day after day and often through the night. she had little to look at and no one to talk to for more than 10 years.
The girl reportedly was uttering infantile noises and still wearing diapers when a social worker discovered the case 2 weeks ago. But the authorities are hoping she still may have a normal learning capacity.
Rigler decided how to focus the research around the time of Jeannie's first birthday at Children's Hospital. Jeannie was now 14 years old. The timing was fitting because Rigler wanted to know, could the clock be turned back for Jeannie? In particular, could a teenager still learn to talk? This had already been the subject of much debate by the time Jeannie was discovered. Chomsky and Lindenberg rocked the field. They were hot. Linguistics was in. It was a perfect time to test the new ideas, recalls linguist Elissa Newport.
What Lindenberg proposed is what's called the critical period hypothesis. And what he suggested is that there's a particular period in the life of humans when they're ripe for learning languages. What this hypothesis was looking for was some more direct evidence. But of course you don't do these experiments. One never wishes to deprive somebody of language during the critical period to see what happens. It happened that at that time, when that would have been the right thing for Lindenberg's hypothesis, Jeannie was discovered.
Stove! Stove!
This is why Susan Curtis joined the Jeannie team. She was a graduate student in linguistics. She would put the critical period hypothesis to its first real test.
Spoon is 4.
This is one of the first videotapes of Curtis's work with Jeannie.
A sharp square.
She wanted, it seemed to me almost desperately, to recode her world with verbal labels. And sometimes we would just stand at a window and she would take my hand and point out the window at a panorama before us, and I wouldn't really know exactly what it was she wanted to know the word for, but she would persist until she at least got a new word. One of my memories was that we would go to a place, say Woolworths, where there would be a stand of spools of thread, and spools where each color thread would incrementally change from the spools next to it. And she wanted a word for every different hue. And I didn't know. I mean, I had a box of 64 Crayola crayons as a child, and I remembered, you know, burnt sienna and all these colors that I tried to extract from my memory, but I don't. English doesn't have words for all of these different hues, and she was very frustrated when I would say very dark blue and very, very dark blue.
For Jeannie, every new object, every field trip was a visit to a magic kingdom. The previous fall, the world had discovered Jeannie. Now, Jeannie could discover the world.
You remember what it was like when you lived at home? What were you sitting on when you ate the cereal?
In the pot.
In the potty chair.
In the potty.
Where did you stay when you lived at home? Where did you live? Where did you sleep?
The pot.
You slept in the potty chair?
While this videotape shows how distressed Jeannie was by her childhood, it also reveals a developmental breakthrough. Jeannie was using language to describe past events. Jeannie was talking about things that happened before words were a part of her world. For a child who barely spoke just a short time ago, Jeannie was doing remarkably well with language. Susan Curtis continued to track her progress.
Right.
Jeannie could read simple words. Her vocabulary was growing. Here she is about to say, I like log.
Let me see. The log? You found a picture of a log. I didn't even know you knew what a log was. Where do you see a log?
I was struck with how different the words that she knew were from the vocabulary words that young children would know when they're acquiring a first language. She had words for emotions: angry, sad, excited, happy. She had words, color words, shape words, square, rectangle.
He likes her.
That's so cool.
Jeannie seemed to be pulling off a linguistics coup. She had passed the critical age of puberty, but she seemed to be learning a first language. Curtis began doubting the notion that there was a deadline for doing so.
My early ideas were that the sky might be the limit. I couldn't help thinking that she might in fact just be able to show that people really were wrong.
Show me the shoe that's untied. Untied.